In 1868, the United States Congress voted on whether to move the nation's capital from Washington to St. Louis. The motion failed by 20 votes. At the time, it probably felt like a minor setback for a city that had every reason to expect it would keep growing. St. Louis was then the fourth largest city in the country, wealthier and better connected than almost any other city on the continent. And for the next 50 years, it stayed that way until the 20th century arrived. Today, St. Louis has far fewer residents than it did a century ago, and its population has fallen by more than 60% since its peak. Large sections of the urban core sit vacant. And unlike many major American cities that face similar pressures, St. Louis responded to each of them in a way that made the next one harder to survive. So how does a city that nearly became the capital of the United States end up doing the opposite of everything a city is supposed to do? St. Louis was founded in 1764 by French fur traders who understood exactly what they were looking at. The meeting point of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers was the central nervous system of an entire continent's worth of inland trade. Everything moving between the Gulf of Mexico and the northern plains, between the eastern seaboard and the western frontier, passed through or near this point. Before the railroad, the highway, or the airplane, whoever controlled that junction controlled the commerce of a nation. By 1860, St. Louis was more populous than Chicago, and by 1870, it was the fourth largest city in the United States, a position it held for 50 years. In 1904, it hosted the World's Fair and the first Olympic Games held on American soil, drawing more than 20 million visitors to a city that was by any reasonable measure one of the great urban centers of the modern world. The proposal to move the capital there reflected a genuine belief, shared by a significant portion of Congress, that the geographic center of American economic power had shifted west, and that the nation's seat of government should follow it. 20 votes in the other direction, and the history of the American city would look entirely different. What the city's leaders could not see, at the height of that confidence, was that the most consequential decision in St. Louis's history had already been made 28 years earlier, in 1876, by voters who thought they were solving a much smaller problem. In 1876, St. Louis city voters approved a measure to permanently separate the city from St. Louis County. City leaders were tired of subsidizing a sparsely populated rural county and frustrated with a county government they considered corrupt. Separation would give the city its own charter and the ability to manage its own affairs without interference from the state legislature or from county commissioners whose constituents barely existed yet. The vote was close enough that a 4-month recount was required before the separation was declared passed. Few people involved in that recount understood what they were deciding. The split locked the city inside a fixed border of 66 square miles that has not moved since. In 1876, that was more than enough. The surrounding county was mostly farmland. Then the car, the suburbs, and the federal highway program arrived. As families and businesses moved outward, every other major American city expanded to absorb that movement, annexing surrounding land and pulling the new tax base back inside its borders. Indianapolis did exactly that in 1970, consolidating city and county into a single government with a tax base that reflected the full metropolitan area. St. Louis tried to do the same thing in 2019, but the proposal failed. By 2019, the separation of 1876 had produced 115 separate local governments in the region, each with its own budget and reason to keep things as they were. The wealth that moved to the county after the war stayed there. The city that had separated itself to gain independence had built a trap it could not vote its way out of, because the trap had spent a century producing institutions that depended on it staying shut. Each of those governments came with its own police force, school district, and elected officials whose careers depended on keeping them separate. While St. Louis was managing its border problem, the global economy was quietly eroding the advantages the city had been built on. In 1914, the Panama Canal opened, and the Mississippi River stopped being the primary route of American commerce, almost overnight. Before the canal, moving goods between the Pacific and the Atlantic meant either crossing an entire continent overland or sailing around the southern tip of South America. The inland river system was one of the country's most important trade routes, and St. Louis sat near its center. After the canal, ships could move directly between oceans through a 50-mile waterway, and the cost advantages that had made river commerce worth building a city around simply disappeared. Goods that once moved through St. Louis began moving through Gulf and East Coast ports instead, on vessels that never came within 1,000 miles of the Mississippi. The railroad had already been pulling freight away from the river for decades. During the Civil War, federal planners had routed the primary Western rail network through Chicago rather than St. Louis, a decision driven by military necessity, but also by sustained political lobbying that Chicago pursued aggressively and St. Louis did not. Chicago sent delegations to Washington and made its case. St. Louis assumed its geographic advantages would speak for themselves and watched the routes get drawn around it. By the time the canal opened, St. Louis had been losing ground for 50 years and had no way to replace what the economy was taking away because the border of 1876 had already made sure the tax base could not grow. A city built on geographic destiny had that destiny canceled by a construction project in Panama. The confluence that had made St. Louis powerful was no longer enough, and what the city did next made everything even worse. St. Louis had already spent decades building legal walls around its black population before the post-war era gave it new tools to do even more damage. In 1916, voters passed an ordinance by a 3-to-1 margin prohibiting anyone from moving onto a block where more than 75% of residents were of another race. When the Supreme Court struck that down, the city turned to race-restrictive deed covenants, private contracts written into property titles that banned selling homes to non-white buyers for up to 50 years. Today, tens of thousands of properties in the St. Louis region still carry those restrictions in their deeds. They are legally unenforceable, but they are still there, written into the titles of homes that exist right now. The post-war decades brought federal urban renewal money and a consensus that the solution to poverty and neighborhood decay was to clear the neighborhoods and start over. Mill Creek Valley was a dense, functioning black community of 20,000 residents and more than 800 businesses. In 1954, the city designated it a slum and targeted it for clearance. By 1959, the entire neighborhood had been demolished, displacing 19,700 people, 98% of them African American, with $100 per family in moving expenses. Much of the land sat vacant for years before being absorbed into highway construction and university expansion. The community that had existed there did not come back together anywhere. It simply ended. The same thinking produced Pruitt-Agot, 33 11-story towers built in 1954 to house the people that urban renewal had displaced. The project was expected to fund its upkeep through tenant rents in a city where the tenant population had the least money, which meant maintenance budgets shrank as the residents who could afford to leave did. The elevators stopped only on certain floors, creating dark stairwells that made the buildings dangerous to move through. Within 2 decades, the towers were uninhabitable, and the first was demolished in 1972. The city had cleared a neighborhood, built a replacement, watched the replacement fail, demolished it, and was left with neither the housing nor the community that had existed before. Interstate 70, completed in 1964, cut through the historic riverfront and separated the Gateway Arch from the downtown core. The highway that was supposed to connect the city to the national economy also cut neighborhoods off from their jobs and pushed out anyone with the means to leave. The planners who made these decisions were applying the standard thinking of their era. The problem was that standard thinking was wrong, and St. Louis, with its fixed border and shrinking tax base, had no room to absorb the cost of being wrong. What that cost eventually produced was a region so fragmented that the damage has proved almost impossible to address collectively. St. Louis today is a region of 115 local governments, 91 municipalities, and 81 separate municipal courts, all competing for pieces of a tax base that a single unified government would share. Some towns that lost their commercial base have kept themselves solvent by collecting fines and fees from their own residents, a practice that gained national attention after the protests in Ferguson in 2014 revealed how local courts had become a way for struggling towns to pay their bills rather than deliver justice. Pittsburgh faced a collapse of comparable scale when the steel industry failed in the 1980s. What Pittsburgh did differently was move deliberately. Its universities, hospitals, and major nonprofits formed a working partnership and began redirecting investment toward technology and healthcare before the old economy had fully gone. St. Louis has assets that could support a similar shift. The Cortex Innovation Community in Midtown has grown into a district of hundreds of companies, nearly 6,000 jobs, and about $2.1 billion in annual economic output. It is the kind of anchor institution that Pittsburgh built its recovery around, and it exists in St. Louis already. The new National Geospatial Intelligence Agency campus in North St. Louis is set to bring more than 3,000 workers to a part of the city that urban renewal and highway construction spent decades hollowing out. The Brickline Greenway project is working to physically reconnect Forest Park to the Gateway Arch and link the city's north and south sides, restitching the urban area that those same decisions tore apart. These are real investments with real potential. The question is whether they can generate enough momentum to overcome a governance structure that was designed entirely by accident to resist exactly that kind of coordinated progress. Whether those efforts can overcome a century and a half of damage built into the system itself is a question the city has not yet answered. The Better Together merger proposal of 2019, which would have brought the city and county back together as a single government, failed because 1876 had spent so long producing separate institutions that none of them could agree to disappear. The fix that would address the root cause of nearly every other problem has now failed twice, and the window for trying again has not yet reopened. St. Louis is a city where every tool that American cities normally use to survive worked in reverse. The border that was meant to give it freedom trapped it. The renewal programs meant to lift its neighborhoods cleared them. The highways meant to connect it cut it apart. And the institutions that were supposed to serve residents became instruments for extracting money from them. Other American cities faced versions of all of these problems. What made St. Louis different was that the split of 1876 had already removed the one mechanism that might have allowed it to absorb them: the ability to grow its way toward a solution. None of that happened because a series of decisions, each logical in isolation, compounded across a century and a half into something none of their authors intended, and none of their successors have been able to undo. The Gateway Arch still stands on the riverfront, separated from the city it was built to celebrate by a highway completed in 1964. That distance is not very far. It has just proved very difficult to close.